It started small, as these things always do. For years, Lancaster County had been under constant pressure from the government. More than most places, it had felt the weight of America's undead empire. The county, once a quiet place of farms and small towns, had been transformed into an industrial machine feeding the very system that so many had begun to hate. The undead were still being used, still being forced into labor, still being kept as an unnecessary cog in a machine that had long since found better alternatives. The people of Lancaster had endured it until they couldn't anymore. The protest began as another quiet march, another group of voices demanding an end to the use of the dead, an end to the government's oppressive grip, an end to an era that had gone on too long. They didn't expect violence. Not yet. But the government did not tolerate voices anymore. The first sign that things were going wrong was when the power cut out across the city. Street lights went dark. Phones went dead. Cameras shut off. Then, the floodlights came on. The military presence in Lancaster had always been suffocating, a permanent force that existed only to remind the people who was in control. But tonight, it was something else. The streets were locked down instantly. Drones hovered over every major road. Barricades were set up within minutes. The marchers' families, workers, students, people who had never held a gun in their lives found themselves surrounded before they even realized what had happened. Then came the sound. The low, mechanical whine of crowd dispersal weapons warming up. The metallic clatter of soldiers stepping into formation. The voice over the loudspeaker. This demonstration is over. Disperse immediately. The people didn't move. This is your final warning. Still, they stood. Then came the gunfire. Not a warning shot. Not rubber bullets. Not tear gas. Live rounds. The first row went down instantly. The crowd erupted in panic. Some tried to run, others tried to fight, but it didn't matter. The streets became a war zone in an instant. Soldiers moved in like executioners, sweeping through the crowds, forcing people to the ground, to their knees, to their deaths. Lancaster was not erased like Seattle had been. It was made into a warning. The survivors were left standing, left to tell the rest of the country what had happened. Not to inspire them. Not to ignite another rebellion. To crush the very idea of it. To tell them what would happen if they tried. Do not bother. Do not resist. You will be steamrolled. The government had spoken. And for the first time in a long, long time, the rest of the country listened. When the dust settled and the bodies were cleared from the streets, a decision was made. The government had seen enough. Lancaster County had been the heart of this uprising, the place where resistance had not just spoken, but fought back. That could not be allowed to stand. America did not simply destroy those who resisted anymore, it broke them. And so, a precedent was set. The people of Lancaster County were no longer citizens. They were something else now. They were classified as third-rate citizens. The official language in government records was clean, calculated, designed to look like policy instead of oppression. But the truth was clear. They were slaves. They could not vote. They could not own land. They could not travel without government approval. Their labor was now mandatory, their rights non-existent. But worst of all, they could be given to the undead at any time. Their lives were now forfeit. If a city needed more workers, they would be sent. If a military zone needed more bodies, they would be chosen. If a demonstration broke out anywhere else in the country, and an example needed to be made, they would be the ones sacrificed. It was the ultimate humiliation. Not extermination, but enslavement. A constant reminder of what happened to those who dared to question the system. The rest of the country watched in silence. No one spoke up. No one protested. No one wanted to be next. The message was loud and clear. America was not just an empire. It was the only thing that mattered. And those who stood against it were no longer people. They were property. The cruelty in Lancaster County never stopped. Once the decision had been made to strip its people of their citizenship, to reduce them to little more than slaves, the government wasted no time making sure they never forgot their place. The first atrocity came only weeks after the decree. A family of 6, accused of harboring a fugitive from the riots, was publicly executed in the town square of Lancaster. Not by firing squad. Not by hanging. But by exposure to the undead. They were bound and gagged, left in the center of the square as government forces watched from the safety of the rooftops. The people of Lancaster were forced to look as the creatures stalked toward them, slow, deliberate, savoring the inevitability of it. The children screamed first. Then came the tearing of flesh, the wails that would never be forgotten. By morning, there was nothing left but the blood-stained cobblestones. The next atrocity came a month later. One of the work camps, assigned to build a new processing facility for the undead, fell behind schedule. The punishment? Half the workers were chosen at random, loaded onto trucks, and never seen again. Rumors spread quickly. Some said they had been sent to special facilities where they would become test subjects. Others claimed they had been thrown into one of the breeding pits, given to the creatures to keep them satisfied. But the most terrifying rumor was the one no one dared say too loudly. That the government had found a way to turn the living into undead without needing to kill them first. That Lancaster wasn't just a work camp anymore. It was an experiment. And no one spoke up. No one fought back. No one dared. Except for one man. The attacks happened in a single night. 3 separate government storage facilities. Each one burned to the ground, reduced to nothing but ash. The security footage from each site showed the same thing. One man. One gun. A .44 Magnum, held as if it weighed nothing, fired with perfect precision, every shot lethal. The footage showed him moving through the chaos like a ghost, dodging bullets as if he could see them before they were fired, weaving between gunfire and flames without ever hesitating. The soldiers who tried to stop him, they never stood a chance. The undead that were unleashed on him, he put them down with ease. It wasn't just the skill that terrified the government. It was the way he moved. As if he had done this before. As if he had been waiting. At the final facility, before the last camera cut to static, he did something no one expected. He looked directly into the lens as if he knew it was watching. And then, he smiled. His eyes glowed in the darkness, not like a man's eyes, but like something else entirely. As if the dark was not darkness at all to him. As if he could see through all of it. And then, in an act of pure defiance, he did something no one had ever done before. An undead soldier, once a man but now a perfect killing machine, stumbled toward him. A normal person would have run. A normal person would have died instantly. But this was not a normal person. He let the creature sink its teeth into his arm. No fear. No hesitation. The soldiers watching the cameras gasped, whispering in disbelief. He's done. That's it. No one survives a bite. He'll be turning in seconds. He was just another fool after all. But then, nothing happened. No pain. No turning. Not even a reaction. The creature was still latched onto his arm, its teeth digging into flesh that should have been blackened and dying by now. But this man simply ripped its head clean off with his free hand, tossed the body to the side like it was trash, and then he laughed. A slow, knowing chuckle, the kind that sent a chill down the spine of every soldier watching. And then he spoke. Only 3 words. Is that it? The facility burned. The footage was wiped from the records, at least, that's what the government claimed. But everyone who had seen it knew the truth. This was no man. This was something else. Something that was not supposed to exist. Something that even the government, the architects of the undead empire, feared. He's worse than a monster, one officer whispered under his breath, watching the flames consume the last of the security feeds. What the hell is he? The Lancaster City Police Station, once a place of law and order, had long since become something else. It was now a military outpost, occupied by government forces, a fortress meant to keep the people of Lancaster in line. It was heavily guarded, filled with armed patrols, surveillance drones, and an arsenal meant for war. It was supposed to be impenetrable. But by morning, it was nothing more than a slaughterhouse. The attack came without warning. No alarms. No signs of struggle. No calls for backup. By the time the first civilians approached the building, the doors were wide open. Inside, carnage. The once proud government forces were gone, their bodies ripped apart, desecrated beyond recognition. Some had been gutted, their insides piled in the center of the lobby like an offering. Others had been propped against the walls, their mouths forced into twisted, mocking grins. Their weapons useless in their hands. Their armor torn apart like paper. Whoever had done this had not just killed them, they had humiliated them. And the message was clear. Because on every wall, every broken desk, every piece of shattered glass, there was one phrase spray-painted in black ink. The Duke of Lancaster County. It was written over their insignia, over their official reports, over the very symbol of government authority. And when the officers arrived to review the damage, they realized something even worse. The bodies, they were all accounted for. But the data, it was gone. Every record, every classified document, every file on the people of Lancaster, on the movements of troops, on the government's control over the county. Wiped clean. Whoever this Duke was, he had done more than humiliate the government. He had stolen their secrets. He had taken their power. And he had made one thing very, very clear. Lancaster County would not die quietly. The people, they weren't broken. And now they had a leader. The government thought it could still control Lancaster County. They thought that fear would be enough, that the people beaten down, enslaved, stripped of everything would accept their fate. But they had not accounted for him. They had not accounted for the Duke. The raid started the night after the police station massacre. Military convoys rolled through the streets, heavy boots marching in perfect rhythm, drones humming above, spotlights cutting through the darkness like knives. Their orders were simple. Find them. Find every last former citizen. Bring them in. Make them disappear. The first house was easy. A family of 5, too scared to run, too beaten to fight. The soldiers broke down the door, dragged them into the street, rifles raised, and then everything fell apart. The first shot rang out before the commander could even give the order. The soldier closest to the house dropped instantly, a perfect shot through the skull, his body collapsing like a puppet with its strings cut. Then the next soldier fell. Then the next. Then the next. The rest barely had time to react, to turn their guns, to search the rooftops. But there was no one there. And then, the last remaining soldier heard something behind him. A whisper. Too slow. The .44 Magnum fired once. The soldier's helmet shattered like glass. By the time the family opened their eyes, the men who had come for them were nothing but corpses. And standing among the bodies, bathed in the glow of a burning street lamp, was him. He holstered the magnum, looked at the family, then smiled. Go. It happened again the next night. Then again the night after that. Every single raid. Every time the government forces showed up to drag someone away, to take another family, to enforce their rule. He was there. Every single time. They deployed faster. He was already waiting. They used armored vehicles. He tore through them like paper. They sent more soldiers, more drones, more undead. It did not matter. They all died. The soldiers whispered in terror. How is he everywhere? We set up checkpoints, roadblocks, we locked the city down. How does he keep showing up? It's not possible. But the commanders? They had already stopped asking how. Because they knew. This was not a man. This was something worse. He moved like he knew where they would strike before they even did. He fought like he had done this 1,000 times before. Bullets didn't touch him. The undead couldn't turn him. And no matter how hard they tried, he never left a single survivor. The soldiers no longer saw him as a rebel. They no longer saw him as a terrorist. They saw him for what he really was. The nightmare the government had created. And the nightmare that had come to claim them. The world had lived in fear for so long. For centuries, America had ruled with an iron grip, its dominance unchallenged, its punishments absolute. No one resisted. No one fought back. No one dared. But now, they had a name. The Duke of Lancaster County. They heard the stories of a man who could not die. Of a man who walked through bullets like they were nothing. Of a man who slaughtered the undead, the soldiers, the enforcers of America's rule as if they were insects. And suddenly, the world began to remember what it meant to fight. The first skirmishes, 2024. The first open rebellion happened in Paris. For years, France had been nothing more than a tributary state, forced to send resources, wealth, and knowledge to sustain the undead empire. The French resistance had been silent for decades, hiding in the shadows, waiting for a moment that had never come. Until now. When the news of the Duke reached them, something shifted. A small group of rebels, no more than 50 men and women, stormed a government armory. It was meant to be a suicide mission. But something was different this time. They fought harder. They pushed further. And when the dust cleared, the armory was theirs. The government responded immediately. They sent drones. They sent armored squads. They sent the undead. The rebels held out for 3 days. On the 4th, the city was locked down. No one knows what happened next. No bodies were found. No signs of struggle. No remnants of a battle. Just silence. The Duke's message had been made clear. Even those who fought back would never truly die. They would vanish into the darkness, waiting for the next moment to strike. The massacre in Cairo, 2025. Not all battles ended in victory. Inspired by the uprising in Paris, rebels in Cairo attempted to seize control of an American-controlled processing facility. They did not succeed. The facility's defenses were too strong, the government too prepared. The rebels fought, but they were outgunned, outnumbered, outmatched. The government gave no mercy. The entire district was razed. Every man, woman, and child eradicated. And in its place, a new breeding ground for the undead. Cairo became a warning. Not every fight would be won. But now, more people were fighting. Victory in Brazil, 2026. Then came Brazil. For years, the country had been one of America's strongest strongholds, a place where resistance had been crushed completely. But when the world saw that the Duke was real, when they saw that the American government wasn't invincible, the fires of rebellion sparked once more. And this time, they won. The first city to be freed was Rio de Janeiro. The Brazilian resistance, long thought to be dead, rose from the ashes. They struck at military convoys, ambushed government officials, and turned the people's anger into a full-blown revolution. When America sent the undead to crush them, the rebels fought like demons. They had trained for this. They had studied the tactics of the Duke. They knew how to kill the undead completely, how to destroy them before they could spread. Within 2 months, the government forces abandoned the region. Rio was free. For the first time in over 100 years, a major city stood outside of America's rule. And the world took notice. The Battle of Tokyo, 2027. Japan had been one of the last places to fall to American rule, and now, it became one of the first to rise up. The battle began as a small-scale riot. By the end of the week, it had become a war zone. The entire city erupted into chaos, with rebels taking control of key supply routes, communication centers, and power stations. The government threw everything at them. The undead, the drones, the mechanized enforcers. For weeks, the battle raged through the streets. And then, he arrived. The Duke of Lancaster County. No one knows how he got there. No one knows how he made it past American defenses. But there he was. And with him, Tokyo was never going to fall. When the government realized who they were fighting, they didn't just retreat. They evacuated. They abandoned the city. Because they knew as long as he was there, they had already lost. The end of fear. The world was still America's empire. But now, for the first time in centuries, the people weren't afraid anymore. For every loss, there was a win. For every fallen city, there was a new uprising. And in the center of it all, the Duke. A man who wasn't supposed to exist. A man who could not die. A man who had become the nightmare of the very government that had ruled unchecked for so long. The war was far from over. But now the people knew something America had been trying to make them forget. The undead could be controlled. But the living could never be broken. The White House had not known fear in centuries. It was the heart of the American empire, the throne of the eternal nation, a place so heavily fortified that no enemy, no assassin, no force in history had ever breached its walls. It was impossible to get inside. Until he did. The security cameras failed first. One moment, the screens were filled with the usual feed guards at their posts, the hallways silent, the corridors watched by countless drones. The next, static. Every system went dead. Every alarm fell silent. The entire White House plunged into darkness. For 30 seconds, there was nothing. And then, he was there. The President of the United States was alone in his office, staring at a stack of reports detailing the growing insurgencies around the world. His hands were shaking. The rebellion was worse than expected. The uprisings were not dying out. And Lancaster County was still out of control. His vice president had told him not to worry. The Duke is just a myth. The people are panicking. We will restore order soon. But now, in the dead of night, with the security feeds cut and the room drenched in shadows, he wasn't so sure anymore. And then he heard it. A whisper. A voice that should not have been there. Tell me, nightmares. The president froze. His blood ran cold. His breath caught in his throat. That voice. It was right behind him. He turned slowly, already praying that this was just in his head. And then he saw him. Sitting in the chair across from his desk, as if he had always been there, as if he belonged there. Legs crossed. Arms relaxed. The .44 Magnum resting casually on his knee. And his eyes. His goddamn eyes. They glowed in the darkness, as if the shadows meant nothing to him, as if he could see through the very fabric of the night itself. And then he smiled. Are you afraid of the dark yet? The president fell backward out of his chair, scrambling against the desk, his hand reaching for the panic button beneath it. Don't bother. The Duke tilted his head. I cut that before I walked in. The vice president's office door burst open, two armed guards rushing inside, weapons raised. But the Duke was already gone. No trace. No sound. No sign that he had ever been there at all. Just the echo of his voice still lingering in the air. And on the desk, a single spent bullet casing, left as a reminder. A message. He could have killed them. He chose not to. This was not an assassination attempt. This was a warning. No one was safe anymore. Not the soldiers. not the enforcers, not even the rulers of the world. The president trembled as the realization hit him like a hammer to the chest. The Duke got in. And if he could get in once, he could do it again. The fear had finally broken him. The President of the United States, ruler of the greatest empire in history, the untouchable master of the undead, had felt true fear for the first time in his life. And he did not know how to handle it. The Duke had walked into his house, had stood in front of him, had mocked him, had left untouched, unchallenged, unafraid. And now, the world knew he was afraid. He had to show strength. He had to remind them all who was in control. So he made a decision. A horrible, irreversible decision. And the world would burn for it. The order was given at dawn. The target? Britain. The country that had once ruled the world before America took its throne, before the undead empire had swallowed the earth. Britain had not rebelled. Britain had not fought back. Britain had done nothing. But the president didn't care. He needed to send a message. He needed the world to fear him more than they feared the Duke. And so, he wiped Britain off the map. It started with a single drone strike over London. Then came another. Then came 1,000. The skies turned black as entire squadrons of bombers, drones, and automated war machines descended upon the island. The cities crumbled first. London was the first to go. Not even the bones of its people remained. Then came Manchester, Liverpool, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Belfast. The British tried to flee. Tried to escape across the sea. There was no escape. Every boat was sunk. Every plane was shot out of the sky. Every living soul was eradicated. By nightfall, the once great empire was nothing but ruins and ash. And then, for the final cruelty, came the undead. Not the mindless hordes of old. The new kind. The kind America had perfected. They were released into the wasteland, turned loose upon the ruins of a nation that no longer existed. The president did not just kill Britain. He turned it into a graveyard filled with walking nightmares. A place where no living thing would ever set foot again. The world watched in silence. Billions of people, across the planet, stared at their screens, at the news feeds, at the images of the smoldering wasteland where Britain had once stood. And they knew. They knew what had happened. This was not about power. This was not about control. This was fear. The president was afraid. Afraid of one man. Afraid of the Duke. And because of that fear, because of one night of terror, an entire country had been erased. And if the president was willing to do this just to prove he still had power, then he was willing to do it again. Somewhere, in the shadows of a burning world, a man with glowing eyes smiled. He had walked into the White House. He had whispered in the dark, And now, the world was ready to burn. And for the first time in centuries, America was losing control. Because the people had finally seen the truth. The government was not invincible. The government was not unstoppable. The government was afraid. And fear? Fear spreads faster than fire. The world had been waiting for this moment. For centuries, they had bowed, they had paid tribute, they had watched as America turned the undead into its weapon, turned entire nations into mindless puppets, and erased any sign of resistance. But now, they saw something they had never seen before. America was afraid. The president's madness, his genocidal destruction of Britain, his blind attempt to prove he still held dominion over the planet had not intimidated the world. It had woken them up. Fear spreads faster than fire. And this fire was about to engulf the world. The start of World War III, 2028. It began with whispers. Governments that had long since submitted to America, that had spent generations pretending resistance was impossible, suddenly began to ask questions again. If Britain could be erased just like that, what's stopping America from doing the same to us? If they're willing to wipe out an entire nation out of fear, then they've already lost control. If we stand together, if we finally fight back, maybe, just maybe, we have a chance. The whispers turned into meetings. The meetings turned into alliances. And then, the declarations of war began. France was the first. It had long been a tribute state, a puppet under America's control. But the destruction of Britain had shaken it to its core. The French resistance, which had been all but destroyed decades ago, rose from the ashes. The moment the government of France announced their defiance, thousands, millions of people took to the streets. The American-controlled forces in the country? They were overrun overnight. The French flag was raised once more. Then came Germany and Spain. They, too, had once been enslaved by the undead empire, forced to serve the will of the eternal nation. No longer. Germany's military infrastructure, once used to fuel America's war machine, was seized by the rebels. Spain declared its independence, its people rising up against their American overseers, purging them with fire and steel. Then came the real shift. Russia, China, Japan, and India, all once bitter rivals, banded together for the first time in history. Each of them had seen the writing on the wall for centuries. Each of them had survived under America's thumb, waiting for the moment to come. And now the moment was here. They joined forces with Europe, forming what was now called the New Coalition of the Living. They would no longer pay tribute. They would no longer obey. They would no longer kneel. But America was still a monster. And it still held both North and South America under its control. The president, enraged, humiliated, declared that all nations who resisted would be turned into nothing more than dead worlds. And to prove his point, he unleashed a new wave of undead superweapons. Creatures that were no longer just the mindless hordes of the past, but something different. Something engineered. The first attack came against Paris. A horde was released unlike anything the world had ever seen. A plague of the undead that could think. That could hunt. That could track human movement with terrifying precision. The government of France was wiped out in a single night. The world watched in horror. But the people did not break. For the first time in history, the undead were fought back in full force. Not by desperate rebels. Not by isolated militias. But by entire nations united against the empire of the dead. Paris did not fall completely. It held. And that was the real victory. The war begins to turn, 2030. At first, smaller nations were still forced to fight for America. South Africa, Australia, parts of the Middle East. These regions had been under American rule for too long, too embedded in their systems to resist. But as the war continued, even America's own allies began to shift. The moment one country found a way out, others followed. South Africa turned on its American overseers in 2031. Australia declared independence in 2033. Even Mexico, long subjugated, began to crumble under its own rebellions. The world was changing. The Duke strikes again, 2034. The war had become a global conflict unlike anything before it. And yet, in the dead center of it all, in the heart of the American war machine, the Duke of Lancaster County was still fighting. He was still moving through the shadows, still hitting America from within. Government buildings burned in Washington, D.C. Undead research facilities were wiped out overnight. Entire military bases vanished, their forces slaughtered before they even knew what had hit them. The president, now fully consumed by paranoia, declared that the Duke was the greatest threat the world had ever seen. Find him. Hunt him down. Burn Lancaster County to the ground. But it didn't matter. Because they could not catch him. No matter how many troops they sent, no matter how much technology they used, no matter what traps they set. He was already ahead of them. And the people of America? They were starting to believe in something they hadn't felt in centuries. Hope. The world is at war, and the outcome is uncertain. America still holds the greatest military force in history. The undead are still a terror unlike anything else. The president is still willing to burn the world to keep his empire intact. But now, the world is fighting back. Now, the people are standing up. Now, the fear is starting to shift. For the first time since America took control of the planet, the undead are not the biggest threat anymore. The president is not the most feared man on earth anymore. Because somewhere, in the darkness, in the ruins of cities, in the places where the government cannot reach, A man with glowing eyes is still moving. A man who has not stopped. A man who will not stop. And the world is waiting. Waiting for him to do what no one has ever done before. Waiting for him to end the empire of the dead once and for all. The president's nightmare had become reality. For centuries, the undead had been his empire's greatest weapon, the force that had secured America's place as the ruler of the world. But now, they were failing. The war had dragged on for 7 years, and with every battle, with every rebellion, the truth had become more and more undeniable. The undead were becoming useless. At first, it was small things. The hordes, once enough to erase entire nations in days, were being stopped, outmaneuvered, outgunned. Countries that had once been helpless against them now knew how to fight back. The coalition of the living had studied them, dissected the old tactics, figured out what made them move, what drew them in, how to neutralize them completely. The things that had once made them unstoppable, their hunger, their mindlessness, their inability to feel pain, had become their greatest weaknesses. Traps were set. Entire legions were led into kill zones. Swamps were flooded with them, turning them into motionless husks. Mines were set along known migration routes. Cities that would have fallen in a day now stood for months, years. The undead were no longer the apex predators of war. Now, they were just another obstacle. And for the first time in history, they were losing. It wasn't just on the battlefield. Even within America, the cracks were beginning to spread. Undead laborers were being phased out, replaced by machines and automation. The very technology that should have made America stronger had made its greatest asset obsolete. Even the engineered ones, the ones that thought, that hunted, that stalked the battlefield with intelligence, were no longer enough. And the people were starting to realize it. For decades, the fear of the undead had kept them in line. But now they saw the truth. They weren't unstoppable. They weren't the end of all things. They could be beaten. And if the undead could be beaten, then maybe, just maybe, America could be beaten too. The president saw it happening. And he refused to accept it. Orders were given. Research escalated. If the undead were no longer enough, then the answer was to make something worse. New abominations were created. Creatures that were no longer even human, things that had never walked the earth before, never existed in the natural cycle of life and death. And yet, for all his desperate attempts to reassert dominance, the war was still slipping through his fingers. More nations had broken free. More cities had revolted. More American citizens were beginning to turn against their own government. And at the center of it all, the Duke. His name had become a legend, a whisper, a force of nature. He had become the nightmare of the empire. And no matter what America did, no matter how much power it threw at him, he would not die. The undead were losing their grip, and the living were beginning to rise again. The day Pennsylvania broke free was the day the world changed forever. It did not happen overnight. For years, Lancaster County had been the heart of the rebellion, the place where the government had tried to crush resistance through terror, through force, through the enslavement of its people. They had burned their homes. They had rounded them up like cattle. They had used them as test subjects, as fuel for their ever-decaying empire of the dead. And yet, they had never broken. The people of Lancaster had suffered more than any other, and still, they stood. And now, after years of blood, after watching the undead grow weaker and weaker, they knew the time had come. This would not be a skirmish. This would not be a protest. This would not be a message. This was war. It began at dawn. The government forces in Pennsylvania woke to gunfire, to explosions, to the sound of a nation that had decided it would no longer be ruled. Rebels in Philadelphia, in Pittsburgh, in Harrisburg rose up as one, overwhelming every checkpoint, every military garrison, every fortress that had kept them enslaved. It was coordinated, precise, brutal. The undead, once unleashed upon their streets as enforcers of American rule, were no longer the threat they once were. They had been studied, outmaneuvered, and destroyed with ruthless efficiency. The soldiers still loyal to America fought back, but they were not prepared for this. They had relied on the undead for too long. They had relied on fear. And when fear was no longer enough, they had nothing left. The people of Pennsylvania had one goal: drive the Americans out. Drive them out of their cities, out of their homes, out of their land. Every street became a battlefield. Every city became a war zone. And at the center of it all, Lancaster County. The government sent everything they had. Thousands of troops, drones, airstrikes, the last of their elite undead enforcers. It did not matter, because the Duke was there. He moved through the city like a storm, striking where the enemy was weakest, taking out command posts, supply lines, key personnel. Every time the government forces tried to regroup, they found themselves ambushed. Every time they set up defenses, they were torn apart from within. It was as if he was everywhere, all at once. And when the final stronghold fell, when the last remaining American troops surrendered or were wiped out, when the undead were nothing more than rotting corpses lining the streets, the people of Lancaster County stood victorious. And they did not just claim their freedom. They claimed Pennsylvania itself. By nightfall, the flag of the rebellion flew over the ruins of Harrisburg. The government was in full retreat, abandoning their fortresses, their command posts, their chokeholds over the state. They tried to rally in New York, in Ohio, in the southern regions where their grip was still strong. But it didn't matter. Because now, the world had seen it happen. A state had fallen from American rule, and the people were still standing. The president, in Washington, D.C., watched in horror. His empire was crumbling. The undead were no longer enough. The people were no longer afraid. The war was no longer under his control. And Pennsylvania? Pennsylvania was now the first free state in over a century. The world was watching. And now, they knew one undeniable truth. America could be beaten. The undead could be destroyed. And the rebellion had only just begun. The fall of Pennsylvania had been the beginning. The original 13 colonies, the birthplace of the old United States, had never forgotten what they once were. For over a century, they had been subjugated, enslaved, used as fuel for America's undead empire. Now, they were taking it all back. The government tried to hold its ground. It reinforced D.C., turned it into a fortress, surrounded by layers upon layers of walls, barricades, and endless hordes of engineered undead. They poured everything into keeping the capital secure. But they were fighting ghosts. They were fighting men and women who had lived under their rule for centuries, who knew their tactics, their weapons, their weaknesses. And they were fighting the Duke. 2036, the battle for the East Coast begins. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, they rose next. From Boston to New York City, from the harbors to the forests, the war erupted into full-scale revolution. The government could not keep up. They had always relied on fear. They had always relied on the undead. But fear was dying. And the undead? They were losing every battle. With every city that fell from government control, the world realized the truth. The people weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting to win. 2037, D.C. under siege. By the time the rebels reached Maryland and Virginia, the government was in full retreat. The streets of Washington, D.C. had turned into a battlefield. The White House was burning. The Capitol building was crumbling. The undead no longer had the numbers to hold the city. The last loyal forces of the American government tried to hold the line. They failed. 2038, the government flees. With the rebels at the gates of D.C., the president made his choice. He abandoned the capital. He and his remaining forces fled south, taking what was left of his command, his weapons, his last surviving undead creations. D.C., the once untouchable heart of the undead empire, was left to burn. By the time the sun rose over the city, the last of the American loyalists were gone. And in their place, the flag of the Free States flew over Washington. The original 13 had broken free. The war was not over. The president still had forces in the South, in the Midwest, in the West. But his strongest grip was gone. His rule over the world had been shattered. The undead were failing. The rebellion was winning. And the Duke, he was still hunting. Because the war was not just about taking back the land. It was about ending the empire of the dead once and for all. By 2039, the world had become a battlefield unlike anything history had ever seen. The fall of Washington, D.C. had been the most significant blow to the American government since the war began, but it was not the end. The president and his remaining forces fled west, retreating into what was once the heart of their power, the old American strongholds of the South and Midwest. The government still controlled much of the land, but the war had shifted. The original 13 colonies were no longer under American rule, and the rebellion had spread across the globe. For the first time in centuries, America was not in control. But the president was not finished. His empire had ruled for too long, had survived too many threats to crumble overnight. He dug in, fortified his borders, and turned entire regions into militarized zones to stop the rebellion from advancing further. What followed was a new phase of the war, a brutal stalemate. The new America, a land divided. By 2040, the United States had been split into two warring factions. On the eastern side, from Maine down to Georgia, the Free States stood defiantly, made up of the original 13 colonies and other states that had slowly fallen from the government's control. The rebels held firm, their forces growing in number as defectors from across the country joined their cause. On the western side, stretching from Texas up to Montana, the remnant government still maintained its rule. These states remained loyal out of fear, forced obedience, or brutal military presence. South America was still fully under government control, and the undead still roamed as tools of war in their last desperate bid to keep power. And in between? No man's land. The trench warfare of 2041. The battle lines had solidified along a brutal front stretching across Ohio, Kentucky, Tennessee, and parts of the Midwest. These states were no longer inhabited lands. They were graveyards of war, reduced to nothing but battlefields stretching for miles, filled with trenches, fortresses, and the walking dead. For the first time, America found itself fighting the same kind of war that had devastated Europe during World War I. But now, it was different. The trenches weren't just mud-filled ditches lined with soldiers. They were fortified bunkers, filled with automated defenses, energy shields, drone swarms, and mechanized exosuites designed for trench warfare. The land between the battle lines, no man's land, was a wasteland of bombed-out cities, collapsed highways, abandoned vehicles, and roaming undead hordes, wandering aimlessly between the two warring sides. Each day, both factions sent raiding parties across the lines, fighting in the ruins, trying to push forward just a little bit. Some battles lasted hours. Others lasted weeks. Neither side was winning. The remnant government, a desperate empire. The president, hidden deep within his underground fortress in Texas, still ruled with absolute control over the western states. His military forces had not been defeated, only held back. But he was growing desperate. The undead were no longer reliable. The creatures that had once conquered the world for him were now more of a liability than an asset. The rebellion had learned how to destroy them efficiently. The soldiers who had once marched proudly under his banner were now exhausted, demoralized, and questioning their purpose. And the rest of the world? They were still fighting. Europe, Russia, and Asia had completely severed their ties with the United States. They had begun launching air raids on government strongholds, crippling supply chains, preventing reinforcements from arriving at the front. The once unstoppable empire was now fighting just to survive. The Duke, a shadow in the war. Despite the stalemate, one figure was still moving beyond the battle lines. The Duke of Lancaster County. Even in the trenches, even in the fortresses and bloodied fields of war, his presence was felt everywhere. He was not leading armies. He was not commanding troops. He was something else entirely. He appeared when he was least expected, striking at key locations, sabotaging government outposts, assassinating high-ranking officials, stealing classified data. No matter how many times the government tried to kill him, he always returned. His name was a legend among the rebels. His name was a curse among the government. And in the president's darkest hours, in the deep, secure bunkers beneath the earth, he knew one thing for certain. The Duke was coming for him. By 2043, both sides knew the truth. This war could not last forever. The trenches, the battles, the endless grinding conflict, sooner or later, something would break. The president was losing control over his own people. The rebels were growing stronger with every passing day. And somewhere, deep in the heart of the chaos, the Duke was preparing for the final move. Because this war was not about land. It was not about resources. It was about who would control the future of humanity itself. And the time for the final battle was coming.